The year is 2002.
Take my love, take my land, take me where I cannot stand.
And I was 11, so let's fast forward a bit. The year is 2008. It's hard for me to really comprehend just how long ago the initial release of Firefly was. It was already nearly a decade old by the time I got around to watching it when I graduated high school. For a brief period of my life around that time, I, like many other young people around my age, was so immersed in nerd culture that it was really difficult for me to conceive of an inner world of somebody who was not. The early 2010s was a revolution of nerd culture taking over and becoming the mainstream. I experienced this all through the juggernaut of fandom spaces on Tumblr. Streaming videos suddenly made available to people things they could previously only access through watching reruns when they caught them on TV or buying expensive DVD box sets. But to even do that, you need to find out about that show somehow. That's something Tumblr was especially good at. You like this thing? Well, here's another thing similar to it, and here also is a vast amount of excess content you can become absorbed into, all conveniently located in this tag. If you are into, say, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you may be interested in other things by Joss Whedon. And while perusing the Buffy tag, you might decide to give Joss's name a little click. Then bam, there's even more hours and hours of content about a completely new thing he did that you previously had no idea about. You like musicals? Well, here's Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. You want more Buffy and somehow didn't know about the spin-off show Angel? Well, there you go. There's fans of it on here, and they are churning out fan art and fanfics and wordy think piece blogs about the parts of Buffy that her friends are meant to represent. Now we all do that on YouTube. I don't know if it's possible to quantify the ways Tumblr helped evolve the concept of a fandom or online community. Tumblr made it a lot easier for specifically young people to find these older shows that had fairly limited runs on actual television and invest yourself in them. Everywhere you looked, you'd find long-winded conversations about the most minuscule details of a show, or movie, or book, or game, or whatever nerdy property you gravitated to most. Where once you'd find yourself trekking through a desert void of sustenance, you found yourself in an oasis of options for everything from people to talk to about the show to branded merchandise as far as the eye can see. It seems to me that few single people benefited more from this earlier Tumblr period than friend of the channel Joss Whedon. He had been a popular creator before, of course, with shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel having quite a bit of mainstream success. But this era of nerd culture uprising breathed new life into his other work as well. Firefly enjoys a legacy like nothing I have ever seen. 14 episodes of fun sci-fi western adventure and a movie near perfectly answering the most burning questions posed by the show. The canceling of Firefly is considered to be the worst decision Fox has ever made by many people. Its jealous guardianship of the rights to the show keeping any continuation or reboot off the table being the second. If so many people loved Firefly, how could it possibly make sense to guard it so closely and not give the people what they clearly wanted? To this day, you will still see people bring up possible reboots or continuations. It's hard to forget the fan effort to raise money for Nathan Fillion to buy the rights and take the show back from the greedy executives. They didn't understand the work of art they were stifling by not producing more content. Nostalgia has a habit of coloring our memories and opinions in ways we aren't fully aware of. Or even if we are aware of it, we often don't care and just love to indulge and lose ourselves in the warm, fuzzy feeling of revisiting things that remind us of a good time in our lives. I've been struggling with this retrospective of the show because on this channel I like to focus on how the media I look at portrays its women and other marginalized groups. Historically, trying to go back to nerdy media of my youth is really disappointing on that front. And anything with Joss Whedon's name on it? Yikes. I'm going to pump the brakes here and talk to you a bit about media literacy. I think on some level most people have a general idea of what it is, but maybe haven't thought much about it. Media literacy is your ability to identify and analyze messages in media, not just something like a TV show or movie, but also news media in magazines or newspapers. Or a YouTube video. Media literacy is a skill like any other. You can hone it with practice and can be better at one aspect of it than another. So maybe you could be very used to analyzing movies but struggle with critically thinking about news media and how it's presented to you. Or you could be very good at identifying underlying messages from news media, but you struggle with critically engaging with a book, or just sort of internalize everything you read without much thought. We all care about different things to varying degrees. The things we care about will dictate how critically we are willing to, or not willing to, engage with that thing. Someone who really likes the same show I like might enjoy just sitting and watching, or rewatching it, and talking about how much they love it. Or maybe you spend all day, every day, engaging deeply with every piece of media you consume and take everything very seriously, sometimes to a point of mental exhaustion. Can't imagine what that might be like. In current year, a skill like media literacy is an important one. Everything you engage with has a creator whose biases and worldview will affect the way the story is told. This is just as true for a news anchor or talk show host as it is for a book or movie or YouTuber. These biases can sometimes be glaringly obvious, even if you don't spend all your time hyperfixating on media. Other times, they are much more subtle and more open to interpretation. For the purposes of this video, when I talk about media literacy, I will be focusing on fictional media because that is more the purview of this channel right now, but on the day this video goes live on YouTube, I will also be posting something on my Patreon with my thoughts on media literacy and nonfiction or news media. So if you're interested in that, patreon.com/writingwomen is the place to go. I'm not monetized, and because of my small viewer base, I'm not really eligible for any sponsorships. So every penny that I make from my Patreon gets put directly back into the channel. It pays for the software and the equipment that I use to do what I do here. All right, now the personal plug is over with, back to overanalyzing a decades-old TV show. You can learn a lot about a person by the fiction they create. Fiction writing is often a deeply personal act. It's people, scenarios, and sometimes whole worlds coming directly from someone's imagination, and so it will be colored in subtle and not so subtle ways by that person's beliefs or personal experiences. If you want a really great example of this, I urge you to watch or listen to anything that covers the fiction books written by Ben Shapiro. The podcast Behind the Bastards has a long series where the hosts read and riff on Ben Shapiro's novel True Allegiance. On YouTube, Jose has done work like this as well. I will link some of these in the description below if you are interested, and somehow have not seen these before finding my channel. This way of viewing fiction as a reflection of the creator is sort of why I started this channel in the first place. To me, it is not just important to look at the media itself, but also the person who created it and sometimes the environment that it was created for. Initially, I always opened videos on this channel by saying that it was a channel where I talked about the women who exist in fiction and the people who created them. It still is that, I just forget to say the thing now, except when I said it just now. So at this time, any media that I cover is going to have a particular bias toward looking at the women and marginalized groups represented in the thing, how they are written, how they fit into their world, and what I think that says about the work and creator. Joss Whedon is something of a personal bugbear for me. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was my mom's favorite show when I was growing up. She was obsessed with it in a way that I now recognize as stan behavior. Were she to have platforms like Tumblr available to her in her late teens and early 20s, I have no doubt she would have been all over them reblogging fan art of Buffy and Spike, and probably even writing fanfiction about how cool Spike is.
Let me rest in peace. Let me rest in peace. Let me get some sleep.
God, she would have thrived as a fandom blogger. She really missed her calling. We moved a lot when I was a kid and sometimes didn't have cable, or at least not the channel that Buffy would be airing on. I know that's a foreign idea to people growing up now, but back in my day, we didn't have the resources to easily find this stuff online. So my mom found a lady in Canada on eBay, I think, who would tape episodes of Buffy as they aired and mail us the episodes so we didn't have to wait until it was all released and buy the whole season in a box set. She still has the tapes, too. All of that is to illustrate just how much of a big deal Buffy was to me. Then, of course, Angel, and once I figured out how to very legally obtain free shows online, I got around to stuff like Dollhouse and Firefly, along with Whedon's credited movies, and also legally obtained free copies of comics he had a hand in creating. I want to look at the show Firefly, the movie Serenity, and a brief bit of background on the actual continuation of the story in the comic series. What can we take from the show, and what can we learn about its creator through critically watching it? To talk about Firefly, it's easiest to start with a bit of a history lesson on the known verse. Firefly and its expanded universe take place in a reality where Earth that was got abandoned in the fairly recent past. A fleet of ships carried humanity to a new universe where they immediately set about recreating the colonial industrial setting that caused the destruction of their home planet, but this time they were able to confine the slums to whole planets and keep them even further from the richest among the population. Out of sight, out of mind, after all. Earth had the problems typical of science fiction stories trying to set up a reason for not having Earth be part of the story. Overpopulation, depletion of natural resources, etc. The only thing to do is move out and then into another place that's all fresh and nice. They conveniently find a universe with no alien races to speak of, so at least there won't be any pesky natives to fight against for their land. It's a very convenient way to sidestep any comparison to real-world colonial efforts and focus on the underdog versus overlords thing that is a constant theme of the show. The struggle for power and domination over Earth eventually came out with the American and Chinese empires on top. Together they lead this effort to settle new worlds, and as a result, there is a blend of Chinese and American influences everywhere. Characters swear in Chinese, the flag of the Alliance is a blend of the American and Chinese flags, and not a single one of the main cast, or really any supporting cast except for a handful of characters in the comics, are Chinese. Weird that. It's almost like he wanted to use what he saw as a Chinese aesthetic without any respect for or inclusion of the actual people he was appropriating from. When people talk about cultural appropriation, this is what they mean. Firefly uses clothing styles, construction styles, fashion, the country's flag, and even a language without showing the actual people forming the other half of the super government. I've heard that the swearing in another language thing was a way to sneak swear words into a TV show, but that doesn't make it better. The Union of Allied Planets, or Universal Alliance, is your standard imperial structure. Planets close to the imperial core enjoy extreme wealth and lives of relative luxury where they can pursue higher education and rarely worry about where their next meal will come from. Planets on the periphery, or rim, are settled largely to provide support for that core. They are mostly for mining, farming, and building things to support the wealthy while living in squalor. In the episode Janestown, we see an example of a settlement that is functionally just a labor camp. The residents are called mudders, and they toil day by day to mine mud that is shipped off-world for use in ceramics. The vast majority of the population live in abject poverty, while the magistrate and those like him live a life of luxury. Years before, the character Jane Cobb, an uncouth mercenary who will sell you out for a check, had a job go wrong here. He had to abandon his take, a large sum of money, to get away, and the mudders see him as a Robin Hood figure, sticking it to the man and giving them back the money they deserve for their labor. They have a statue of him and drink to his name, even writing folk songs about his heroism.
Our love for him now ain't hard to explain.
The hero of Canton, the man they call Jane.
The show takes every opportunity to show the horrors of Alliance control, with Janestown being one in a long line of examples. It's no surprise that with such a stratified hierarchy, the people at the bottom would eventually rebel and try to live independently. Which leads me to the Browncoats and where we begin this story, the pilot episode named identically to the later movie, Serenity. This hour-and-a-half-long pilot starts during the Unification War. This was a war where Rim planets attempted to win independence from Alliance control. The independent forces, or Browncoats, were crushed after a climactic battle in the Serenity Valley on the planet Hera. Though the war technically went on after this battle, there was no more hope for the independents winning. Sergeant Malcolm Reynolds was the highest-ranking Browncoat to participate in and survive the battle. He carries that dubious achievement with him the rest of his days. The independents lost the war, and the Alliance unified all the planets in name, if not in spirit. Mal eventually purchases his own ship to captain with his former comrade-in-arms Zoe Elaine Washburn as his first officer. Washburn is her last name after she marries the pilot they hire for the ship. They will observe no laws except the ones Mal sets for them as captain and take every opportunity to stick it to the Alliance. Over and over in Firefly, we are reminded that the Browncoats were the good guys, with Mal even saying to an Alliance bootlicker,
"They've been the losing side. Still not convinced it was the wrong one."
We see examples of the Alliance's abuse of power and neglect on the outer worlds rightfully as very bad, and are presented with the Browncoats as the solution to these abuses. Get the Alliance out of here and let us govern ourselves. Good people will take care of each other, and we can frontier justice anybody who does anything bad.
And don't you ever stand for that sort of thing. Someone ever tries to kill you, you try to kill them right back.
With the show's retro-futuristic style leaning towards an American Old West or Southern feel in the border planets, it's impossible to not see the parallels between the Browncoats and the American South in our own Civil War. In fact, Joss Whedon read a book about the Civil War and got the idea for the show. The book is called The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. It's about the Battle of Gettysburg and the time leading up to it. Joss became obsessed with the idea of frontier life and the view from the losing side of a major war in a futuristic Reconstruction era. People forced to live in an alliance they would have laid down their life to get away from in a future where whole worlds are at the bottom of the ladder. Joss was interested in a future where we don't solve all our problems like the fully automated luxury space communism of other properties and instead maintain our existing stratified social hierarchy, and have dirty ships that are operated by outlaws just trying to get by in a system designed for keeping a boot upon their neck at all times. To hear a Southern apologist tell it, the War of Northern Aggression happened because the Union just wouldn't leave the little guy alone and wanted to step in and tell everyone what to do. You hear states' rights as the reason for the war from anyone who doesn't want to admit that it was really over the states' rights to own human beings as slaves, or people who are propagandized into believing that by the folks around them. That brings us to one of the more glaring, problematic reads of Firefly, that it is a show glorifying the Confederacy by adopting its aesthetics and making them the good guys.
And I'm thinking you weren't burdened with an overabundance of schooling. They've been the losing side. Still not convinced it was the wrong one.
Though I understand this reading of the show and don't begrudge people who see it that way, I do, however, think the show does a good job of distancing itself from the specific issue the American Civil War centered on. Simon Tam is a brilliant surgeon who abandoned a high-paying job on the planet Osiris to carry out a rescue mission for his sister River. She had attended an academy for extremely gifted children and sent Simon coded messages begging for help. His parents didn't believe him, so he forfeited his inheritance to fund this rescue, making him and his sister outlaws constantly on the run from the highest levels of the Alliance government. At the academy, they were torturing River, trying and succeeding to create a psychic super soldier. Unfortunately, the process left her mind broken. During the rescue, River was put in a cryogenic storage crate, and Simon found passage aboard the Firefly-class ship Serenity for him and his illicit cargo. When River is discovered, Mal immediately goes on the attack, assuming that Simon is trafficking this girl into slavery, likely of a sexual nature. He backs off after finding out the whole story, but his opinion on slavery is clear from the jump. It's hard to watch the scene and not think of it as a conscious attempt on the part of Whedon to make sure the viewers know that though they might resemble the American Confederacy in vibes, they do not stand for the same values. This message remains true for the rest of the show. In the final episode, a top super secret Alliance operative named Jubal Early is the antagonist. He takes down all the crew members one by one and is eventually humiliated and defeated by River. While editing this video, I talked to a friend of mine about Joss Whedon and the book that inspired the show, and he offhandedly pointed out that Jubal Early is named after a Confederate general whose name had to have been plucked straight from the Killer Angels. I'm not sure you really need any more evidence on where Joss Whedon stands on the issue of who were the bad guys in the Civil War. So if they don't match up with the Confederacy in beliefs, then what did they actually stand for? Well, the Browncoats are libertarians. The fantasy of no big government and complete personal autonomy with no laws made by people far away who don't see the up-close effects those laws have. They are being crushed by the abusive imperial force that wants to control everything about your life, so the only response is, well, a civil war. To be completely reductive, it's basically an ideology that Confederate apologists believe the Civil War was fought for, even if they don't know to call it that. This allows people who look at real-life history and side with the South to see themselves in the Browncoats, even if that wasn't the writer's intent, and steps were taken to prevent that exact reading in the story itself. Most people who believe the Civil War was fought over a nebulous idea of small government and states' rights aren't secretly thinking about how it was actually over slavery. They have either been raised in or bought into that belief because it's a lot easier to think about than the real thing. And so Mal's vehement condemnation of potential slavery isn't inconsistent with their view of themselves and the history they believe in. So though I disagree with the reading of this show as glorifying the Confederacy, I think it's very important to address it when I talk about Firefly. The pilot episode Serenity opens with the Battle of Serenity Valley, but what comes after? Well, years later, Mal and Zoe have assembled their outlaw crew, and during a job stealing from the Alliance, they are spotted. They get away with the goods, but their score is now too hot to sell to their original buyer, Badger, on the planet Persephone. While Mal deals with Badger, he tasks his mechanic with finding passengers so they can make some more money. The crew of Serenity is at first Mal and Zoe, the pilot and Zoe's husband, Hoban Washburn, or Wash, the aforementioned jerk mercenary, James Cobb, and the mechanic, Kaywanet Lee Fry, or Kaylee. A resident of one of the ship's 2 shuttles is Inara Sarah, a companion who rents the shuttle to do business out of while traveling the verse. She's on the ship, but not considered part of the crew. In the show, you don't get a whole ton of background on Wash, Jane, Inara, or Kaylee, with much more of the time being spent on Mal and Zoe's history in the war, or Simon and River's past in the Alliance Inner Planets. There are brief mentions of family members left behind from Kaylee and Jane, but they don't get the kind of focus the others do. Perhaps they would have been given more to their backstory on screen had the show not been canceled halfway through its first season, but that's something we won't ever know. Or maybe we do know because there are the canon comics to consider. We also don't get much in those other than what we already know from the show. Another character without much backstory is one of the passengers Kaylee lures to Serenity. Shepard Book is basically a Christian missionary who has left the abbey he lived in for a long time to spread the good word. Kaylee points out that he should come with them because he's not looking at ship's destinations while searching for one to seek passage on. He's looking for an experience, and that Serenity has in abundance. Most of the in-depth things we know about Book come from the supplemental comic The Shepherd's Tale. A terribly missed opportunity to call it The Shepherd's Book. It tells the story of Henry Evans, from his life as a young man living with an abusive and alcoholic father to his time joining the Browncoats, then killing and assuming the name of Dariel Book, from an Alliance recruit for an extensive undercover operation as a mole. He rises through the ranks and becomes known throughout the Alliance as a ruthless soldier with a desire to end the war by any means necessary. Eventually, he is given the boot after a huge operation under his command is ambushed and 4,000 lives were lost. He lives as a vagrant for a while before having a religious epiphany and becoming a preacher. In the show itself, all we're given about him is his knowledge of things about the Alliance that a random preacher shouldn't know, and that the Alliance still holds him in some high level of esteem, because when they find out who he is, an Alliance ship agrees to take him in and treat a grave injury. After Book, the other passengers Kaylee secures are Simon with his mysterious cargo and a man named Lawrence Dobson. Mal intends to fly to the terraformed moon Whitefall to sell his hot cargo to a woman named Patience despite her and Mal's antagonistic past. If you're watching this and have seen the show and are wondering why I haven't said much about Inara yet, don't worry, it's coming. Be patient. Dobson sends a signal to the Alliance that he has found Simon and his cargo. He's with the Alliance and undercover. Wash cuts off the signal but has no idea how much got out before catching it. Mal mistakes Simon for the undercover Alliance person at first until Dobson reveals himself by just pointing a gun at them. Before he is captured, Dobson shoots Kaylee. An Alliance ship is on their tail now, and Mal wants to hand Simon over to get that wanted level down. Simon won't save Kaylee if Mal turns him and his sister over. Mal wants to know why they want Simon so badly, so he opens the cargo while ignoring Simon's protests. This is the scene I mentioned before where he goes aggro on Simon, thinking that he's trafficking the girl. They keep on heading toward Whitefall, and Serenity passes a Reaver ship. These ships are covered in spikes and weapons. The Reavers remove the containment cores from their engines so they go faster and allow them to run down their prey, but that exposes them to constant high radiation that results in mutations and furthering their madness. The old crew are terrified and hold their breaths as they pass, hoping the Reavers don't notice them. The new guys, especially the coddled rich boy Simon, are surprised to find out the Reavers even exist, and all the nightmare stories about them are true. In Serenity the film, River discovers that the Reavers are the result of an Alliance experiment on the farthest settled planet Miranda. This planet is now deep in Reaver territory because it is where they originate. The Alliance was attempting to chemically modify settlers to make them more peaceful. The alteration worked too well, though, and made the people so docile that they stopped doing everything, working, talking, and finally eating. They died off except for a few people. A fraction of a percent of the population had an adverse effect. It stoked their rage, turning them almost animalistic and purely driven by a desire for violence. This was the birth of the Reavers, who now haunt the space of the Rim and menace the people trying to eke out a living there. The Alliance obviously covered this up, but one thing they didn't consider was their other horrible, torturous project with River Tam. During her time at the Academy, she was shown off to high-ranking Alliance officials, which put her now active but uncontrolled psychic abilities in a situation where she accidentally learned a lot of deeply hidden government secrets. She is driven to investigate Miranda, and the crew broadcasts what they find there to the entire verse to show them what the Alliance has been doing behind closed doors. River seems lost and childlike, her mind stuck where it was when they began experimenting on her. She experiences hallucinations and a barrage of thoughts from others because of her inability to control her psychic powers. She experiences periods of lucidity, but is often confused and scared. They get past the Reaver ship without incident and set down on Whitefall. They set up the deal with Patience and prepare for her obvious double cross. Dobson offers Jane money to betray Mal, but Jane doesn't take the deal. Dobson escapes anyway, though, and manages to knock out Book in the process. After the showdown with Patience, the Reaver ship shows up again after deciding to hunt them down after all. They all get back on board and throw Dobson out before pulling a Crazy Ivan maneuver where they ignite the Reaver ship with the Firefly ship's exhaust and flee Whitefall. Mal offers Simon a permanent place on board.
May it become apparent to you that the ship could use a medic. You ain't weak.
Book has a moment where he thinks he may be on the wrong ship, surrounded as he is by violence and outlaws when he's been trying to escape that life. Inara tells him he may be exactly where he needs to be, though. When Firefly first aired in 2002, Serenity was not actually the first episode watchers would see. That honor goes to The Train Job. If you're watching the show now on streaming services or very legally owning digital copies, you've probably watched them in the current order, with Serenity first and The Train Job as a second episode that awkwardly sets up the characters again and rehashes similar moral dilemmas as Serenity. A pilot for a show like this has the job of introducing all the main characters and establishing who they are along with enough about the world around them to tell us why we should be interested. Usually, the pilot will be a deciding factor in whether or not a network pushes a show forward. For Firefly, though, they already knew they wanted the show. They just didn't like Serenity the episode, and so The Train Job was written in a very short period of time. So instead of the series starting with a literal bang at an intense battle and following with a story that has intrigue, suspense, and mystery, it began with a bit of a whimper, with all the relevant characters already being on the ship and having to be introduced to the audience after they've already established relationships with other characters. In the original pilot, we would have seen the small core crew of Mal, Zoe, Wash, Kaylee, and Jane meeting the new members and figuring out how they would all fit together as a crew. Starting the show more in the middle of the whole crew being together isn't inherently a bad thing. In fact, plenty of shows do this, and it works great. Unfortunately, The Train Job just isn't a very strong first episode, and watching it definitely feels like watching a creator's second choice for an intro to their story. Which, of course, it was. It's as solidly written as most other episodes of the show, but didn't leave the grandest first impression that the initial feature-length pilot might have. This is one of the many things that eventually contributed to the show's downfall. Ratings for Firefly were consistently low, and that is what eventually made the network cancel before it could really get going. Though it technically continued in comics after the show and film, the comics suffer the same problems as the Buffy comics. Inconsistent quality and really weird story choices that kind of change what people loved about the show for the worse. That more than anything tells me it's better off that we didn't see more of the show because the comics, though not strictly written by Whedon himself, are considered canon to the story. So, Zoe having a baby is canon. Cool, that's a great callback to her and Wash talking about having a family. But also, Mal abandoning Serenity and going off alone, leaving his ship to be captained by Zoe is also canon. The comics have kind of fizzled out, and I think that's probably a good thing. I've kept you in suspense long enough, so let's finally talk about Inara. Inara Sera is a companion. In the lore of the show, there is a companions guild that teaches everything their high-class clients could possibly want with trainees, beginning at around age 12. Companions are engaged for sexual intercourse, but also to attend parties, dinners, and official functions. They are knowledgeable about art, music, and anything else you can imagine someone in their job field might need to know. Her presence on Serenity gives it an air of respectability and can get them into ports that may otherwise not let them dock. The companions in this show are much like a Japanese oiran, which is different from a geisha. I sometimes see people confuse the two. Oirons are high-class sex workers that learn, well, all the things I said the companions do. Geisha are more performing artists and entertainers. Inara is the most confusing character in the show, not always because of how she herself is written, but by how the show plays out around her. On the surface, it may seem to be supportive of sex work in this case because of the elevated position in society that people like Inara enjoy. And that would be great if we didn't actually see the way certain people treat her, and I don't just mean people we're supposed to see as bad guys. Repeatedly, we see people reveal how little they think of Inara as a person because of her career. And by people, I mean only Malcolm Reynolds. In the pilot, our introduction to her is after an engagement with a client who offers to take her away from all this and she refuses. So we see that Inara enjoys her life and the freedom it offers. This pattern plays out more than once with the show making sure that we understand that the people trying to take her away from being a companion are in the wrong. That is immediately undercut by the way our hero, Malcolm Reynolds, who is supposed to be in love with her, talks to her and about her. In between bouts of calling her every slur he can think of for someone who sometimes has sex for money, Mal fights a duel to defend Inara's honor from a client who believed that he could own her since her affection was for sale. When she confronts Mal about this later, he says he doesn't respect her profession, but he does respect her, which the other guy did not. But do you really respect someone that you constantly belittle? that you deliberately put in uncomfortable situations, like in the pilot episode, introducing her to Book as a joke, hoping to irritate the preacher, who may frown on women of the night. She repeatedly tells Mal not to enter her shuttle unannounced and to stop calling her rude names, and he barely ever even acknowledges what she says on those matters. He dismisses them with a quippy line and does it again the next episode. Through all this, we are meant to believe that Mal and Inara are in love, but just can't admit it to one another or even themselves. How is Mal any different from the guy who tried to buy her when he more often than not treats her like shit? He's a good guy, so obviously he doesn't mean it when he says these things. He just can't admit how he feels. That's some, oh, he only picks on you because he likes you energy. It's well past time we stop teaching anyone, but especially women, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you will abuse you, and you should just hang in there because they don't really mean it deep down, and also, you can fix him. In the comics that take place after the show and film, Inara and Mal are actually together. She has been barred from the guild for her part in what happened on the planet Miranda. She is no longer a companion, but Mal still takes every chance to bring up her past in a derogatory way, at one point saying that she must have some nice clothes still laying around from her sex work days. Except he doesn't say sex work. She yet again reprimands him for throwing slurs at her, and yet again it is dropped. People can and do point at the writing's interactions with Inara to say that it is super misogynistic, but then how do we explain Kaylee and Zoe? Kaylee is the heart of the ship, its crew, and the show itself. She has this upbeat and kind demeanor that makes it feel especially cruel when Jane mocks her for her crush on Simon, or a group of upper-class girls mock her in the episode Shindig. Kaylee and Mal attend a fancy party so Mal can meet with a potential client for some smuggling business. Mal gets her a dress she had gushed over earlier in the episode, and she is ecstatic at finally having something she sees as nice and classy, like the things Inara wears. Wealthy people are, of course, awful to be around, though, and a group of young women at the party basically tell her she looks poor.
Shamu, your girl, she's not very good. She made you a dress that looks like you bought it in a store. Oh.
In a perfect world, Kaylee would be an example you can point to and say, see? You can't say this show is misogynist. Kaylee is smart, funny, tough, and excels in a traditionally masculine field. She even likes traditionally feminine things and doesn't reject them as a point of principle because she's just one of the guys. Unfortunately, in this one single case, there are more women on the cast. Zoe is strong and rather stoic, always following orders and loyal to a fault. This negatively affects her relationship with her husband because Wash always feels like he's playing second fiddle to Mal. After Wash dies in Serenity the movie, the comics go on to show Zoe being super pregnant and having a daughter whom she names Emma. These are two very well-developed characters, despite how little we learn about Kaylee's life before joining Serenity's crew. But they are also the most non-stereotypically feminine presenting, so they are allowed that depth. River isn't easy to fit into this because in the show, she is less a character and more a symbol of the horrors of the Alliance. In Serenity the movie and on through the comics, she becomes a bit more of a person with wants and needs, but it's hard to fully move away from her as MacGuffin. Even in Serenity the movie, where we see more of her as a kid, she still seems more like a construct than an actual child with actual desires. Looking back at Inara again, what is there to her character? Well, she is nice, pretty, cultured, nurturing, loves her job, and supported unification in the war. Why did she support unification? Well, that's a good question. We know Mal and Zoe were browncoats, and at least for Mal, we have a specific reason he hates the Alliance. We don't know much of Zoe's life before the war, but we do know she was career military, unlike Mal, which at least implies a respect for military authority and leadership and informs her actions when she remains loyal to Mal as his first officer, treating jobs on Serenity the ship like they are military engagements. In the comics, we find out she couldn't stop fighting after the war ended, and she joined up with the Dust Devils, a group labeled terrorists by the Alliance for continuing to fight and disrupt their forces despite the war legally being over. One of the first things Inara says to Mal after renting one of Serenity's shuttles is that she supported the Alliance in the war, and they just never explore that.
I supported unification.
Did you? Well, I don't suppose you're the only whore that did.
That's the last time you get to call me whore.
In the comics, we find out a thing she did during the war, but that still doesn't give us much about her personal beliefs leading up to it. It seems like such a glaring oversight to have all this history and motivation for the other people who make a point of letting their opinion on the war be known and none for Inara. One of the hardest parts about creating believable characters is trying to motivate them. Through bits and pieces of conversation, we find out Mal was raised on a ranch and received a pretty good education, but of course, the Alliance came knocking. That's why Mal hates the Alliance. It's really weird to not have that for Inara when everybody else in the show is given something that informs the why of their existence. Jane is sending money home to his poor family. Kaylee grew up around machines and loves being able to work on an old beauty like Serenity and dreams of opening a mechanic shop with her father. The Tams were prodigies, but now Simon is trying to find a way to help his sister recover from her torture. Book seeks to spread the compassion and love of his God to people who may need it as much as he did at his lowest. Wash is a wife guy.
Tell me I'm pretty.
Were I unwed, I would take you in a manly fashion.
'Cause I'm pretty?
'Cause you're pretty.
It all seems so glaringly obvious of an oversight until we remember Inara is the love interest for the main character, and thus does not need to have motivations of her own. She just needs to be a thing that is pretty and verbally spars with him because he's too much of a manly man to talk about his feelings, and also hates the profession that is less a job for her and more of a way of life. She gets to have a lot of moments where she looks off in the distance sadly or breaks down crying after finding out Mal had sex with a friend of hers who's a former companion. And that's another thing. Mal's opinion on sex work seems to only be super negative when it comes to Inara. In the penultimate episode of the series, Heart of Gold, our gang helps out a brothel run by a former companion. Mal doesn't seem comfortable there because of his almost puritanical view of sex, but his normal aggression toward Inara anytime her job comes into the conversation is largely gone. When talking to or about the other women, that is, he's more passively uncomfortable than outright aggressive. The madam of the brothel, Nandi, clocks Mal's infatuation with Inara but thinks it is one-sided and so pursues him. She tells him about how she left the companion life because it was too stifling for her, and we see that she and Mal have a lot in common before, of course, they do the deed. Nandi realizes the next day that it wasn't one-sided because though Inara can hide it from everyone else, Nandi intuitively recognizes how upset she is about the whole thing.
Andy, believe me, I'll be fine.
You'd think this may create some sort of realization in Mal that this person who is a lot like him still chose to be a sex worker over doing something else. Maybe have some character growth where he realizes he's been terrible to Inara, and after meeting and protecting these people, he could start to change. Maybe Nandi could even guide him that way. He could have this weird hang-up about them having had sex, and that doesn't compute with his view on sex. She could be a really cool character to come back up later in the comics or something after Inara and Mal actually get together. But don't worry, we don't need to have any of that pesky character development. She dies at the end of the episode and is immediately forgotten about. Joss Whedon tried very hard for a long time to be seen as the woman's man in Hollywood, the premier feminist whose contributions to strong female characters are unmatched. All other things he has done aside, his feminism is narrow-minded and shallow as a puddle. In recognizing that, Firefly's inconsistencies with its female characters become a lot more easy to reconcile. He was a dude trying really hard to be feminist, but couldn't keep his misogynistic beliefs on things like sex work out of his show. That is one thing I think it's important to take from Firefly. You can learn a lot about a creator by the things they create, after all. It also shows us that though something can have really problematic aspects, it's still good and worth remembering fondly or rewatching. Critically watching it didn't lessen my enjoyment at all, actually. There's a really good article called How to Be a Fan of Problematic Things that I read for this, and I will link it in the description because I think it's very important in a modern media landscape to really explore an idea like that. I hope this video has at least given you something to think about, even if you completely disagree with me on all points. If you do, feel free to leave a comment and I will respond to the best of my ability, at least for the first couple of weeks. I recently moved again and seem to have lost my good microphone in the sea of boxes yet to unpack. Fortunately, I still have my old one, but the quality here is spotty at best. I want to take a moment here to really thank my patrons for making this all possible. I've done a few personal update blogs on there the last few months, so supporters know how hectic my life has been and all that I've been dealing with. Y'all keep the lights on at this channel, and I cannot begin to express my gratitude in a way that feels even remotely accurate to how I feel. If you'd like to join my lovely patrons, you can find me at patreon.com/writingwomen and support for just $2 a month. My patrons are up on screen right now, and this could be your name in the next video. I post personal blogs on there along with some behind-the-scenes content and early video access. Thank you for spending all this time with me today. I hope you have a good one. I hope you can't hear the shifting of my clothes.